Imagine opening your eyes one morning, expecting an ordinary day, only to feel a suffocating heaviness in the air. The silence outside is not calm, but unsettling, as though the world itself is holding its breath. You step outside and see people frozen in place, pointing at the horizon with trembling hands. And then you see it, the sun, not rising from the east as it always has since the beginning of time, but climbing from the west, casting shadows in reverse. In that moment, every soul knows this is no accident of nature, but the sign promised for centuries. The day when repentance closes forever has begun. The morning began like any other, but there was something in the air, an invisible weight pressing down on hearts before anyone understood why. People awoke to a silence that felt unnatural. No dogs barking in the distance, no children shouting in the streets, not even the usual song of birds announcing dawn. The air was thick with an indescribable tension, as though creation itself was waiting. Some dismissed it at first, thinking it was nothing more than their imagination. But as they stepped outside, the world around them confirmed that this was no ordinary morning. Eyes turned instinctively toward the horizon, to the place where the first golden rays of light should be stretching across the sky from the east. But instead of the familiar glow, there was darkness. Confusion rippled through the crowd of early risers, farmers waiting for the sun to signal their day shifted uneasily. The elderly who had witnessed countless dawns felt their hearts tighten with dread. Mothers clutched their children, whispering that something was wrong. And then someone pointed with a shaking finger, their voice breaking as they shouted what no one wanted to believe. The sun was rising, but not where it always had. From the western horizon, light began to creep upward, slow at first, then undeniable. Shadows stretched the wrong way across the earth, twisting the familiar into something alien. Homes, trees, and people cast shapes in directions they had never seen before. Birds took flight in chaotic patterns, their instincts thrown into disarray. Some circled endlessly, unable to choose a path. Others dropped from the sky, their wings failing under the weight of a cosmic order reversed. At first, people stared in disbelief, unable to comprehend what they were witnessing. Some rubbed their eyes, convinced it was a trick of vision. Others muttered explanations, whispering about strange weather, about an eclipse, about phenomena they did not understand. But deep in their souls, every heart felt the same jolt of recognition. This was not science. This was not a coincidence. This was the moment they had been warned about, the sign that generations had dismissed as legend. The streets began to fill with people. They stumbled out of their homes, some half-dressed, others barefoot, eyes wide with terror. Murmurs turned into shouts, and shouts into cries of despair. "It is the end," someone screamed. A woman collapsed, clutching her chest as her child wept beside her. A group of men fell to their knees, raising their hands in trembling prayer, their voices breaking as they begged for forgiveness. Others simply stood frozen, their minds unable to process the enormity of what was unfolding before their eyes. In every corner of the world, from crowded cities to isolated villages, the reaction was the same. Ordinary life screeched to a halt. Work was abandoned, markets were deserted, laughter died on people's lips. Every gaze was fixed on the horizon, every soul struck with the weight of prophecy fulfilled. For centuries, stories had been told, hadith recited, sermons delivered, warning of this exact moment. Children had once listened half-heartedly, doubters had mocked, and even the faithful sometimes wondered if it was too distant to imagine. But on this day, in this sunrise, all doubt was obliterated. The realization swept over humanity like a tidal wave. This was the morning when mercy had ended. This was the moment when the unseen had become seen. Belief was no longer a matter of faith but of sight, and that meant belief no longer had the power to save. People clung to one another, tears streaking down their faces. Neighbors who had never spoken of religion before turned to each other in panic, confessing regrets, muttering prayers they had ignored all of their lives. Hearts screamed with a single unified thought. We should have believed when we had the chance. But no amount of regret could turn back the sun. It climbed steadily across the western horizon, indifferent to the chaos it unleashed below. The world itself felt disoriented, the very rhythm of life upended. It was as though time had split, dividing everything that came before from everything that would follow. The reversal of the sun was more than a celestial event. It was a verdict, one that pierced into every soul without exception. And as the western dawn spread its alien light across the earth, humanity entered a silence heavier than any before. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of fate sealed. The silence that comes when the final page of a story has been turned, and there are no more words left to write. The world had become a place unrecognizable to those who had lived in times of peace and order. With the sun's reversal and the emergence of the beast, humanity was stripped of every illusion it once clung to. Days and nights passed in heavy silence, broken only by cries of despair, prayers uttered with trembling lips, and the low and ending murmur of fear that clung to every city, every village, and every desert plain. But even amidst this chaos, another shadow was preparing to rise, a shadow long foretold in the words of prophets, whispered across generations, and feared by all who understood the weight of destiny. It was the shadow of a man, yet not like other men, the one who would be called Al-Masih ad-Dajjal, the false Messiah, the great deceiver. At first, whispers spread before him, stories carried by travelers, rumors passing from ear to ear. They spoke of a figure gathering followers in the farthest lands, a man of immense charisma, claiming powers that defied natural law. He healed the sick with a mere touch, restored sight to the blind, even brought the dead back to life, or so it appeared. People spoke of rain falling at his command, of barren lands suddenly blooming at his word, of treasures rising from beneath the earth when he willed them. To the desperate and the ignorant, it seemed as though mercy had returned to the earth through him, a savior to rescue them from despair. But to those who remembered the warnings, every tale tightened the knot of dread, for they knew that these wonders were not gifts from Allah, but trials meant to ensnare the hearts of the heedless. When he finally appeared, he did not come quietly. His arrival was a storm, shaking nations with promises and displays of might. His stature was imposing, and his presence overwhelming. Yet there was something unsettling about him. One of his eyes was clear and piercing, the other ruined and lifeless, like a shriveled grape. Still, his defect was overlooked by many, for his tongue was sharp, his words intoxicating, and his miracles undeniable to those who had already lost sight of truth. He proclaimed himself a Lord, a guide, even the very God of creation, and the weak, the desperate, and the greedy fell at his feet. The Dajjal moved across the earth with a speed and dominion. Cities opened their gates to him, leaders bent their knees, and multitudes rushed to his call. He carried with him rivers and fire, what seemed to be a stream of water flowing with life on one side and a blaze of consuming fire on the other. Yet those who remembered the words of the prophet knew the truth, that his water was fire and his fire was water. Still, countless people, driven by thirst and desperation, chose the path that seemed safe, only to be consumed by what lay hidden beneath. The faithful who resisted him suffered beyond measure. He cut off sustenance from those who refused his claim. Land under his shadow flourished with rain and greenery, while lands that rejected him withered into famine. Hunger gnawed at bellies, thirst cracked lips, and fear stalked every step of those who clung to their belief in Allah. Yet they endured, for they knew that the fleeting comfort of following him would cost them eternity, while steadfastness in hardship would preserve their souls. Everywhere he went, the line between true belief and falsehood grew sharper. Families fractured, some seduced by his illusions, others resisting with tears and steadfast hearts. Entire nations fell into his deception, while small bands of believers hid in mountains, caves, and barren lands, living on scraps and water, clinging to their prayers and the remembrance of Allah. It was a time when the test of faith reached its peak, when survival itself became a battlefield between loyalty to the Lord of the heavens and submission to the deceiver who walked the earth. The Dajjal's arrogance grew with every city that is submitted to him. He would laugh in the faces of those who denied him, boasting of his so-called divinity. He would point to the sky, and rain would fall. He would point to the ground, and treasures would rise. His hand waved over the sick, and they stood healed. But what he gave with one hand, he destroyed with the other, reminding humanity that his so-called gifts were only shackles, designed to enslave the weak-hearted. And then came the day when he declared the greatest of lies, that he was the very Lord of creation. He demanded worship, not merely loyalty. Temples were erected in his name, banners flew with his emblem, and his followers raised chants that echoed like blasphemous thunder across valleys and mountains. Those who worshipped him were promised food, safety, and wealth. Those who resisted were hunted, tortured, and left to starve. It was as though the earth itself had been divided into two camps, those who followed the beast mark of truth and those who now bent to the Dajjal's mark of deception. Yet even in this darkness, the faithful did not despair. They whispered to one another the promises that had been passed down, that the Dajjal would not reign forever, that his tyranny had an appointed end. They remembered the words that spoke of a man, a descendant of the prophet, who would rise in those days, a man called Al-Mahdi, the guided one. His name alone became a light of hope, a spark of resistance burning in the hearts of believers who had been stripped of every worldly comfort. And so, as the Dajjal's shadow stretched across continents, news began to spread of another rising figure. He did not emerge with miracles or illusions, nor did he demand worship. Instead, he gathered the scattered believers, uniting them not with promises of wealth or food, but with the reminder of Allah's truth and the call to prepare for the final struggle. His presence was calm, yet powerful. His leadership humble, yet unshakable. Where the Dajjal enslaved with fear and temptation, Al-Mahdi called with sincerity and resolve. The believers rallied to him, though their numbers were small compared to the armies of the Dajjal. They came ragged and weary, their faces gaunt from hunger, their clothes torn by hardship, but their hearts burned with a fire that no deception could extinguish. Under his banner they stood not for wealth or survival, but for the honor of truth, ready to endure whatever trials lay ahead. And though the Dajjal's dominion seemed unbreakable, the faithful knew that this gathering marked the turning of tides. The world trembled as the stage was set. On one side stood the deceiver with his legions of the deluded, his illusions, and his false promises. On the other side stood the Mahdi with his band of steadfast believers, armed not with illusions but with faith, not with treasures but with resolve. The air itself seemed to carry the tension of what was to come, as though creation held its breath for the clash that would shake the earth and unveil the next chapter of destiny. The world stood at the edge of a storm. The Mahdi had gathered around him the believers who refused to submit to the Dajjal, but their numbers were few compared to the vast multitudes under the deceiver's sway. Every day was a struggle for survival. Hunger gnawed at their bodies, thirst dried their throats, and fear pressed against their hearts like a crushing weight. Yet they endured, clinging to the certainty that Allah's promise was true and that no trial would last forever. The Mahdi, with his calm guidance, became a pillar for them all. He led them not with grandeur, but with humility, reminding them of the words of the Prophet Aaron, words that spoke of patience, steadfastness, and the nearness of divine relief. Then came the time when the armies of the Dajjal prepared to march against them. The sound of drums, the clash of weapons, and the roar of thousands filled the earth like thunder rolling across the land. Cities that had bowed to him emptied their men into his rank, until his army swelled into a sea of blades and banners stretching beyond the horizon. His voice echoed among them, claiming victory before the battle had even begun, declaring himself the Lord of all creation and mocking those who still resisted him. His arrogance knew no bounds, and with every step his army took, the earth trembled as though it too feared what was about to unfold. The Mahdi and his followers stood firm, though their forces were a mere fraction of the deceiver's legions. They prayed with tears in their eyes, their foreheads pressed to the earth, begging Allah for strength and deliverance. They knew they could not win by numbers or by might, but by faith alone. They carried their swords and shields not as warriors drunk on glory, but as servants of Allah ready to defend the truth until their last breath. The night before the great confrontation, silence hung over the believers' camp. The stars above seemed brighter than ever, as though even the heavens leaned closer to witness what was to come. It was then that a miracle long foretold unfolded. In the stillness of dawn, as the believers prepared themselves for what seemed like their final stand, the heavens split with light. A brilliance descended from above, and radiant, illuminating the world in a glow unlike any sunrise ever seen. The sound of trumpets, mighty and unearthly, reverberated through the skies, and the hearts of the faithful trembled not with fear, but with awe and hope. From the heavens descended Isa ibn Maryam, Jesus, the son of Mary alayhi salam, wrapped in garments of light, his hands resting on the wings of two angels. His face shone with serenity, his breath misted in the cool air, and wherever his gaze fell, truth cut through falsehood like a blade through cloth. The Mahdi and his followers fell to their knees, tears streaming down their faces as they beheld the one whose return had been promised. Isa alayhi salam descended gently to the earth, his feet touching the ground near Damascus. The fragrance of purity spread across the land, and the hearts of the believers filled with a strength they had never known. The Mahdi stepped forward, humbled, offering his leadership to Isa alayhi salam. But Isa placed his hand on the Mahdi's shoulder, affirming his role, praying behind him as a sign that his mission was not to replace the guidance of Muhammad, but to affirm it. News of Isa's descent spread like wildfire. The Dajjal, who had boasted endlessly of his false divinity, now trembled with fear, for he knew that his lies could not survive in the presence of the true Messiah. His illusions began to waver, his arrogance faltered, and his followers felt doubt creep into their hearts. Yet the Dajjal, though shaken, still clung to his deception, rallying his legions to destroy the faithful before Isa alayhi salam could confront him. The battlefield was set. The Dajjal's army, vast and overwhelming, filled the plains, their banners black against the horizon. On the other side stood the Mahdi, Isa alayhi salam, and the believers, few in number, weary in body, but invincible in spirit. Isa's presence alone, was enough to shake the earth. He did not come with armies of angels or rivers of weapons, but with a power far greater, the truth of Allah, the command that no falsehood could withstand. The moment Isa alayhi salam approached, the Dajjal's power crumbled. His miracles faltered, his illusions faded, and his followers began to waver. What once seemed like rivers of life dried into dust. What once burned with false fire turned cold and lifeless. The deceiver's voice cracked with desperation as he shouted to his army to hold their ground, but their hearts were already shaken. Then Isa alayhi salam advanced toward him, his steps firm, his gaze unwavering. The Dajjal turned to flee, running in terror, his arrogance shattered. The one who had once claimed to be a god now fled like a coward, his legions scattering before the presence of truth. Isa alayhi salam pursued him to the gates of Lud, where destiny had decreed his end. With a single strike, Isa slew the deceiver, and in that moment, the chains of deception that had bound the world shattered. The earth sighed with relief, the skies brightened, and the believers fell to the ground in prostration, praising Allah for delivering them from the greatest trial in history. The reign of the Dajjal was over, his lies silenced, his shadow erased from the world. But the story did not end there. With the Dajjal destroyed, Isa alayhi salam turned his mission toward restoring truth and justice across the earth. He broke the crosses that had been raised in his name, corrected the lies told about him, and called humanity back to the pure worship of Allah alone. The Mahdi stood by his side, leading the believers as Isa guided them with wisdom and clarity. Together they began to heal a world torn apart by deception and tyranny. Peace began to return, but it was not an easy peace. The scars of the Dajjal's reign ran deep, lands ruined by famine, hearts broken by betrayal, and nations fractured by falsehood. Yet with Isa's guidance and the Mahdi's leadership, hope bloomed once more. Justice spread across the earth like dawn, breaking after the darkest night. The believers, once hunted and starved, now walked freely, their voices raised in prayer, their tears flowing in gratitude. And though the trials of the end had not yet finished, the greatest deceiver had been vanquished, and truth once more stood tall upon the earth.